Um, Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Helen, for inviting me to be a part of this, and to Alex and Lucy for supporting this at the Bodleian, and of course the British Academy for enabling this kind of wonderful outreach and engagement projects. Today we're going to talk about the making of Tristram Shandy, why it's one of the strangest but most significant literary experiments and printing experiments for centuries. Some of the volumes that we'll talk about today are on display next door as part of the exhibition, so you can see them very closely. You can examine them if you'd like to afterwards. And of course, there's a huge amount to say, and we're not going to be able to talk about every aspect. Normally, I wouldn't be comfortable presenting about a novel that I hadn't read, but I admit I have never read Tristram Shandy, but I've used it because it's not made to be read. I've turned it upside down and mentally scribbled in it and puzzled over it. And that is a feature, not a bug. In the first edition, for example, there's a chasm of 9 pages in which the reader has to turn the book upside down in order to continue trying to read it and understand the mental gymnastics of the physical object, the printing process, the text itself, which isn't always written with letters, and the overarching narrative. I think Helen has even danced to Tristram Shandy, interpreting the visual representations narrative within it as 18th century dance notation. So by the end of this talk, we hope you'll be able to read it or use it or dance to it in your own way, and to better marvel at the devastatingly witty commentary on the processes of printing and producing and consuming content. I should say this is followed tomorrow by the workshop Storylines, and we thank Peter Laurence from the Society of Wood Engravers, who'll introduce the technique of carving illustrations in wood. Louise Brockman will demonstrate marbling with a single leaf, and Richard Lawrence and the team at the Bodleian's Bibliographical Press will guide you through setting type and demonstrate the printing of the plates. The final event at the date TBC will be at Thin Ice Press at York, led by Helen Smith and J.T. Welsh, University of York and Thin Ice Press, together with Helen Williams. So please do.
So the sort of the concept, if you like, of the network novel impressions, the idea has been to bring together academics who work on 18th century literature and perhaps the history of the book with practicing printers or curators of printing museums, to provide content for workshops and to engage the public in new ways. So the series has been able to bring together people to explore, I guess, the 18th century origins of the kinds of formats that we're comfortable with today, and the fact that the physical contours of the novel, for instance, were ultimately invented in the period in which we're sort of immersing ourselves today. So I think Tristram Shandy is a really excellent example of considering the kinds of experimentation which was on the table in the 18th century when the novel was just at its beginnings, and how we've sort of perhaps come to accept some of those regulations which were imposed during this period as a result of the print technology which was available for producing the novel, to accept those things as sort of invisible or as regular when they were by no means regular in the period in which Sterne was writing. So I think Sterne is such a pioneer, and what we're going to do today is sort of highlight some of those experiments, so we can really appreciate the extent of that experimentation.
I think a key part of this is that you can't always agree with the secondary literature. You have to go back to the primary. You can't trust that either. And here we have a very simple title page that belies the complexity that follows. For example, it says 1760, but it was printed in 1759. So even from the start, you cannot trust what this book says. And this is indicated by the complex publication history of the first edition. So what you see on the slide is just the first edition. We have 9 volumes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 publishers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different years. And the 9 volumes are published in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 separate episodes. So it is complicated. It's in many ways a labor of love for the process of novel writing and textual creation, but also for the printing process. And we know that extensive correspondence between the author and the publisher survives about the appearance of the book. This is really unusual. but as an experiential and experimental object of print, not a text to be read, but a book to be used. The form and the appearance are of maybe equal or greater content than the text. We know that the author traveled from Yorkshire to supervise the printing in person for each volume of the first edition. It was unheard of, and it must have been a bit of a nightmare.
I think it's also experimental in form as well as content. So I think this page is a really famous and well-remembered page from Sterne's novel, which describes Tristram's sort of as a narrator of his own autobiography, his struggles to tell a story in a straight line. He says, I keep getting myself tied up in knots. And this is the way each one of the volumes so far has gone. I haven't gone in a straight line. I've sort of had these detours in these digressions. And this image is meant to illustrate the extent of those digressions and the fact that quite often Tristram finds himself going backwards instead of forwards. So the novel itself was experimental in its non-linearity, we might say today. But also, I think we also have to appreciate how rare it was for a novel in the mid-18th century to be illustrated from its first edition. Even using a technology which was relatively cheap, like woodblock technology, it was rare for novels to have engravings included in them, and for those engravings not to be advertised, in the newspaper ads and the hype, if you like, around a new text. And I think that is one of the key elements to appreciate about what would have been so striking to Tristram Shandy to its earliest readers. The fact that you would open a volume and you would be surprised. You would be surprised to find a newly commissioned cut, for instance, illustrating the experimentation of that novel. I think that's a really exciting moment for readers, and one which often gets overlooked when we forget about the sort of the 18th century world in which that novel was first received.
Absolutely. And I think this kind of interpretive device was unparalleled. I'd like to compare it to experimental musical notation for indeterminate compositions that you get from the most progressive American and European music composers of the 1950s. So what you're looking at on I always forget which is which, on the right, is an elements of a score that John Cage created in 1958. And he called it a camera from which anyone can take a photograph, because his role was not the creation of music, but a part of facilitating engagement with the people who were producing and then hearing the composition. It transferred the authority from the composer to the performer in the way that Sterne or Shandy or the printer forced the book's reader or user to provide that content, to provide the meaning. I think today we'll talk about who the author was, Laurence Sterne, then the fictional character, Tristram Shandy, then the features of the book, and then Helen will guide you through on a guided tour of the Bodleian's copies. So who was Laurence Sterne? Who created the strangest, but maybe the most significant, literary experiment in print for centuries? It was him. He was a clergyman and a writer. He was from a very prominent family. His grandfather had been Master of Jesus College, Cambridge, Archbishop of York, but his father did not inherit much of the family wealth, so he had to join the army. He was in a low-ranking position, traveled frequently, did not earn much. So his uncle paid for his education. So he went to Jesus College, Cambridge on scholarship. He was first a clergyman, a centrist Anglican. He married Elizabeth Lumley while they both had consumption. And his uncle Jacques, a prominent Whig and clergyman, supported him. And then as his second profession, Jacques urged him to become a political journalist. He wrote propaganda for about a year, but it was disastrous in a short-lived second career, and they never spoke again. And as his third profession, he decided to dedicate himself to writing in 1759. And that year, his mother died. His wife and his daughter were very ill and nearly died. And he wrote 18 chapters of this new book in a frenzy in 3 months, just January to March. And he borrowed money to print the first volume later that year in December. And then from 1760, he had this dual profession. He was so successful as a writer, or at least so controversial in a good way, that he was rewarded with an appointment as a curate. So he had a very unusual career trajectory there. And his motivation as an author was about the public reaction. There was nothing like this. Helen, do you want to talk a little bit about why he was writing?
Well, I mean, he was struggling for money financially, came to writing quite late in life. He was in his 40s. He was not a young man, and he was conscious of the fact that he had to provide for his family. I mean, I think it describes like farming the land and growing actual cabbages in his garden, which I think was illegal. If you were a priest, you weren't supposed to farm Christian land. So yeah, I think he was quite disappointed really when a political romance was suppressed, was burned, and wasn't literally burned, but suppressed. Copies do survive, and I think he felt like he could do more of that sort of satirical writing, and that was when Tristram Shandy was sort of the genesis of it began. And yeah, he always, I don't know if he's a bit tongue-in-cheek about this. I wrote not to be fed, but to be famous, but he absolutely had to be fed as well. But he fed on the sort of celebrity that the novel brought him. And he enjoyed being in London to be recognised as a sort of major figure in that period. And he did sort of find it entertaining when criticisms of his work came out in pamphlet form, or sort of satirical attacks on him. He thought any good publicity is good publicity, ultimately.
Yeah, I always said the best is that they abuse and buy it, and at such a rate we'll go on with the second edition as fast as possible. So I see in the chat Thomas B has said his image of nonlinearity found a later reference in Hogarth's notion of serpentine lines. Yes, that's a work of art theory, and even in earlier works of art theory you do have depictions of that could be visually similar, but to my understanding they were not used to represent narrative structure. To carry a text. So for that initial reception and the controversy, we know the second edition, the first London edition, appeared immediately in 1760 with the frontispiece by William Hogarth. Thank you, Thomas B, for that note about Hogarth. We know Joshua Reynolds painted his portrait for free. We know that additional publications started coming out very quickly with that same frontispiece. And we were thinking of putting up a visual that could communicate the rapidity and complexity of the later issues, even in the first decade. But there are so many of them, and the publication history is so robust and so complex. We decided to leave it summarized here that the adaptations were popular for at least the next 100 years, and sometimes shaped the content of Sterne's following volumes. So you have that complex issue of linearity.
David's right about the analysis of beauty, and I think we'll come back to that in a sec when we have a look at the flourish from volume 9. I think it's a really good precedent for thinking about the prevalence of the serpentine line, but also I think Hogarth and Sterne's quite interesting relationship as artists in that period. Thank you.
So that is who Laurence Sterne was, but who was Tristram Shandy? Sterne created an alter ego who was hidden among this constellation of characters that clustered around Tristram Shandy. The unraveling of the story, which took 9 volumes and a total reimagining of what a book as an object could be, had an interesting life. So here he is. Here is Tristram Shandy in a frontispiece to later editions designed by Hogarth. He is a fictional character, and the story recounts his biography and his family stories, but in an unprecedented style that we'd now consider postmodern. It's anti-chronological. It jumps backs and forwards in time. Tristram only gets around to mentioning his birth in volume 3, for example. And the words were not enough. He needed those squiggles and blank pages and dashes and other visual and bibliographical material to tell his life story.
And I think what is striking as well is that Tristram doesn't know where to start his story. He really wants to tell the story of his life, but he feels like in order for us to understand his life, he needs to sort of start from the generation before, from his father and from his uncle, from his mother. And so actually, I think it is really notable that when Hogarth creates this frontispiece of the Shandy family, Tristram isn't there. This is the generation before. This is Corporal Trim reading out a sermon in what has become one of the sort of the preeminent scenes from the book, with Dr. Slop, the midwife, and Tristram's uncle and father arguing about the content of this sermon and the sort of religious doctrines. I guess that they all have their own interpretations of what's happening here, and Tristram is sort of recounting this secondhand, and I think that shows some of the knots that he finds himself getting in, but also the fact that this is and probably a novel unlike any other.
Um, and it is the biography of Tristram Shandy, but as Helen said, in so many ways it isn't. These are some of the characters who are involved, and we thought it was important to talk very quickly about this lineup. So each character has some absurdity or central contradiction, both deeply serious and deeply absurd. At least the men. The women are not very well-developed characters. But these
much more sensible, in my opinion. Much more sensible.
True. For some of the main characters here, Tristram starts his biography by talking about their lives. So his father, Walter, was obsessed with preparing Tristram's education, but neglected to actually educate him. Uncle Toby's an ex-military fighter who's terrified of women, possibly due to a groin injury. Corporal Trim, his low-ranking servant, has the most noble concerns about human suffering. Susanna, his mother's trusted servant, is accident-prone and, in one case, causes an accident that leads to Tristram's circumcision with a falling window while he's trying to stand inside and urinate outside. Parson Yorick, a close family friend, is very clear-speaking and plain-talking, a clergyman. He might represent Sterne. He's then killed off, but resurrected through a jump in time.
So he dies in volume 1 of 9, but he also speaks the last words of the novel. So I think that sort of tells you about the twists in the tale.
So that is who the author and the character is, but what is Tristram Shandy? And this blank screen is not empty. It is full of meaning, absolutely full of meaning, because using the means that I have available to me now to communicate to you, it is a recreation of a mourning page, a page of grief. Here you can see what the reader encountered in the first edition. Alas, poor Yorick, and then blackness. Mourning, you might think it's a form of censorship, which is very well attested in books over the centuries like this. This is an example from the 1540s, but it doesn't. It expresses grief through the medium of print. Whitney Tretian has written about mourning pages in English book culture in the previous century. And a plain black page like poor Yorick's was printed in, for example, this anonymous elegy on the death of the Right Honourable Spencer, Earl of Northampton, in 1643. And other examples like this refer in the text to the all blackness of the printing ink, and by extension, the grief of a nation upon the death of Prince Henry in 1612. In this mourning page from 1613, you can see how difficult it is to achieve an even black film across such a large surface. It's difficult the pressure is very well distributed, at least using the kind of printing ink and printing press available in 17th and 18th century England. Mourning pages were commonly found in elegies, commemorative poetry on the death of significant aristocrats and royalty. But Sterne used it in fiction to note his characters and readers' grief at the death of a clergyman. So maybe his readers recognized it as an outdated convention or comically inappropriate or an out-of-date way to mark the passing. It's absolutely fascinating and bizarre stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the century before, isn't it? This is almost like 150 years before
Yes.
Yorick's death. And so I think, essentially Sterne is calling upon quite an antiquated practice by this point of representing death, but one which is ultimately decorative. And I guess the joke is the fact that we've only just been introduced to this guy Yorick. We've only just learned to like him, to appreciate the sort of quirks of his character, which is that he always jokes at somebody else's expense, and that gets him into trouble. And then he's dead straight away. And actually, the expectation that you might mourn over somebody who you've known for just a few pages is also, I think, part of that joke and part of the surprise. And I think some critics have interpreted the black pages as sort of exaggerated full stop, because it sort of plays upon these sort of stops and starts and the strange chronology of the novel.
I love that it also treats the grief as that of national grief upon the death of royalty. It's extraordinary comment on the history of print and the audiences of the book as well, all bound up in one big black rectangle. But he also used more modern or contemporary means for typographically communicating the grief at the death.
Yeah, so I'm quite interested in the sort of the more 18th century counterparts for these sort of typographic practices of representing death. And one of the things that I've been really struck by is partly the the mourning borders that you might find on the title pages of sermons from this period, which was sort of advertised to readers that what they were going to read was a text which was about death and commemorative, but also the use of something that most typesetters would have had in their cases, which was black leadings. And immediately before the black page is introduced in Tristram Shandy, we have the Yorick's epitaph, alas poor Yorick, itself an allusion to Hamlet, framed in this way. And if we look to newspapers of the year before, for instance, like the image from Lloyd's Evening Post on the slide, you can see that this was a convention which even newspaper typesetters had recourse to explore how to represent death, but not just death, but the coffin and the location of a corpse, which I think is a really clever pun, actually, because the coffins that were recorded in the newspapers tended to be coffins to nobility, and those coffins tended to be lined with lead. And so I think there's this sort of almost like a tongue-in-cheek statement about in that process of imprinting a paper with lead to indicate where a body is, which is a joke that I think Sterne would have appreciated and perhaps might allude to himself.
Another and perhaps more joyful, at least more vibrant way of using the book unexpectedly to communicate the narrative and to relinquish authorial control of the content is the use of marble paper. In volume 3, he offers the reader a motley image of my work, which is chosen by somebody else and vastly different by necessity in each copy. It's a piece of marble paper that's cut to fit the dimensions of the text block and pasted in. There can be somehow instructions to the binder. In the first edition, so each of those 4,000 copies would have been marbled differently because paper marbling is, as you can see here, a project that is manual. It is not possible to exactly replicate marbling. In the first edition, the margins were folded back. The paper that was printed on, so the paper from the text block, had the margins folded back, and the paper, the page number was stamped by hand. Hand stamping is less laborious than handwriting, but much more than printing. So marbling requires skill and chance, and it's an excellent security tool because, unlike printing, it is effectively impossible to duplicate it exactly. And also adding the marbled paper added time to dip and to dry. It disturbed the printing process, the binding workflows, and added an element of risk in the construction of the books and, of course, in the interpretive process. At the time, marbled papers were routinely found outside books, perhaps in the opening of the binding. So here he's bringing the outside in, continuing to upend the authority of the writer and involve others in that craft of his narrative when riffing on the materials and the processes of bookmaking. This example is by the Brockman Binders, and Louise Brockman will lead the marbling workshop tomorrow. Helen, do you want to talk a little bit about the marbling in the first edition in the Bodleian's copies?
Sure. I mean, we'll have a closer look under the visualizer later on, but I think what's really interesting is the hand stamping of the page numbers. You can see that they haven't been printed using movable type. They're a little bit more wobbly, and basically somebody's had to, through a person, try and create a stamp which mimics the Caslon typeface, which had been used throughout, to make it look as if the marbling has been part of this sort of printing process, but actually it had been appended later. And I think also the intervention within the gathering that requires, the way that books were made from large sheets, which were then folded into their pages, and then having to figure out whereabouts actually an extra page might fit into this new order, which upsets the order that anybody sort of making books would have been comfortable with. I think is again a major intervention into the printing house, which would have probably not made them very popular.
I really like in the first edition how the pages of the book themselves are marbled, but the margins of the typeset area are respected. So it's chaos within rules. Not all of the marbled papers were actually marbled. In the Dublin edition of 1761, you have hand painted marbled paper. So hand painting that imitates marbling. So again, there are different levels of divergence and chaos within the authorial control. Ellen, did you want to talk about marbling in a broader context?
Yeah, so just to add to Elizabeth's excellent point, which is about marbling being a sort of anti-counterfeiting measure in the 18th century, most commonly found on banknotes, for instance. Another sort of area in which marbling was used to create a sense of authenticity was in medical packaging. And so on the slide, we've got a photograph of an original packet of Dr. James's fever powder, which was one of the most sort of popular proprietary medicines in the period, and one which Sterne himself had taken. And I think, like, I don't know how well you can see the image, but the marbled border with the white rectangle label on the inside is almost like an inversion of the marbled page. And I think it might be a bit of a stretch, but you can also imagine like an open wrapper of this medicine sort of in some way resembling the marbled page as you might encounter it open in the book. I think this is particularly fitting considering the volume in which we find the marbled page. This is volume 3, and this is a volume which is obsessed with Tristram's accident, whereby during his birth, his nose is crushed through the forceps delivery. And his father, Walter, is distraught about this, not just about the fact of the broken nose, but about how that might be representative of another bodily member and how Tristram might then have other difficulties in life. And there are all sorts of allusions in this volume to venereal disease, to the symptoms of syphilis, and to the kind of medicines that one might turn to ameliorate that kind of illness. And so I think the fact that marbled paper was widely advertised as something that you might look for to make sure that you're getting the right medicine is an interesting sort of context that we might not be as familiar with today.
I think, speaking of ways of marking authenticity, or what later developed into security printing in the 18th century, we do have marble paper. But if you look at this, you can see that Newbery's name is handwritten. And with Sterne, let's talk about his authorial interventions within the printing process. He did the same thing. To counter piracy, he signed all 4,000 copies of the first edition for volumes 5, 7, and 9, and in the second edition of volume 5. So that is, what is that, 16,000 signatures. And this, again, must have added hugely to the cost, much less to repetitive strain injury for his poor wrist.
Yeah, and I know some people who are a little bit suspicious about this, and I think that his daughter Lydia might have helped.
Sure, a number of people must have. But it added hugely to the cost because of the delays that would have been involved in the printing and binding process. Printing is a batch task. This is the sort of the danger, isn't it, of producing a serial novel, and one which is really popular and which sells well, is that if you've got writer's block and you're struggling to bring out your next installment, then somebody's going to get there before you. And the fact that it's been, historically published anonymously without a name on the title page sort of makes that almost an open invitation for somebody to do so. And so Sterne does start to worry about how actually can I authenticate a book which the ethos of which is sort of about being unique and individual in every copy. And this is just one of the ways, I guess, in which each copy of the first edition of Tristram Shandy has its own sort of unique qualities. But yeah, so the Newbery signature on the medicines is partly due to the fact that medicines tend to be sold by booksellers in the period. So there's that really sort of natural at that time connection between the bookselling business, book production, and medicines. And John Newbery, who was the stockist for James's fever powder, like Dr. James himself, who originated the fever powder, and like Laurence Sterne, all three of those men were members of the Society for the Encouragement of Arts and Manufactures in the 18th century, which sent out a call to promote the generation of mass production of marbled paper in England in order to sort of guard against the continental dominance at that time of particularly French marbled paper. And so these guys are sort of connected in this world which was trying to encourage English manufacturers of paper materials. I think, as an art historian, I'm familiar with discussions of this, of the signatures. It's signaling the artistry, the conception, and the realization of this project, like he's treating each copy as a unique artwork, not a printed multiple, something that required a signature for authenticity. But as Helen has said, the story is actually so much more complicated, as you would expect for this kind of book. Here we have another kind of authorial intervention. I think, Helen, this is one of your favorite ones. Do you want to?
Yeah, I love this. I mean, look at that bravo with a strike through. So for ages as a PhD student, I was like trying to find other instances of printed strike through. And like, I mean, you guys might know, I don't know any earlier instances of printed strike through in the history of the book. I think this is a really exciting moment. And it's clearly one which has caused some difficulty because those letters of the bravo are not typeset. You know, they've been produced to resemble the typeface, the Caslon typeface, but they look to me as if they might have been produced using, you know, a wood engraving.
Could it be a wood engraving?
Yeah. What's interesting about this is that this particular word is really important in its context. This is a moment in the novel where one of Corporal Trim, you know, our dead, Parson Yorick, our dead Parson Yorick, who we've already commemorated in volume 1 with the black page, with all that ink and with the engraving, with the woodblock business. We find one of his sermons, the Shandy family find one of his sermons, and it's a manuscript, and Yorick has self-annotated his manuscript in an evaluative way. And first he thinks it's really great. He's like, yeah, bravo, go me. And he writes this in the margin, and then later on he's like, oh, actually, I just don't think it's that good. And he crosses it out. And this is about Tristram and his family's sort of response to that very embodied moment of Yorick's sermon writing and of Yorick's self-reception, which is itself, of course, also a reflection of Sterne's own self-reflection and consternation about his reception as both a novelist and as a parson who was publishing his own sermons in this period. And so the fact that this word sort of crosses that manuscript and print divide and sort of signifies both at the same moment, and in the process of revision and of emendation, I think is just almost like the most perfect moment.
It's also, as far as I'm aware, a unique example of xylographic text, or text cut from a woodblock, that at this time that it was used without imagery. There were decorative
I don't know. I think it's quite common with Greek, for instance. If you didn't have Greek movable type, you would use that.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But for the Latin alphabet, I'm not aware of another example of xylographic text that was produced without a decorative context.
Question for the floor.
So yes, do let us know. I think we should move to the objects themselves. Helen, can I very quickly talk about 2 more points that I think you're going to discuss, and then hand over to you to give us a tour through the object. A couple of other points that Helen and I think are hugely significant are the use of wood engravings as text or as narrative devices. Part of the narratives in volume 6 and 9 are squiggles. This is this part of path of Trim's stick, and the way it's discussed in the narrative would be wood engravings, not woodcuts. But you can see here there's a calligraphic nature of the line. The line swells and narrows and swells and narrows. The printers here, the art historians, might say that that is the hallmark of intaglio, of metal engraving. When you have a pointed burin, the harder you press it into the metal, the more metal you displace. So you can get that calligraphic effect by raising and lowering the burin. Here we have this effect created in wood in relief. So it's much harder to achieve this kind of regularity in the fine lines in wood. And we also see this in other parts of the text. So the corporal gave a flourish with his stick in this way, and Helen is an expert dancer and historian of dance, as well as many other things. And so this is how she was able to recreate dance steps to the squiggles in Tristram Shandy, using a historically appropriate interpretation of dance notation from the time.
That was a whole different project. but yeah, so here we have an example from what is known as the Beauchamp-Feuillet system of dance notation, which is like a shorthand for indicating dance steps. In the mid-18th century, it got really exciting because not only were dance steps themselves notated in this way, but the location of those steps were able to be mapped across the floor in a way which showed movement as well. And I think Sterne must have been really interested in alternative means of expressing movement. And I think Trim's flourish is a fantastic example of a line which is supposed to express movement and transitoriness, but which sort of reads really awkwardly, actually, because to my mind, you know, if you want to read it left to right, you're sort of going from bottom to top, which feels a bit awkward. Or if you want to go from top to bottom, you're going right to left. And I think it sort of causes its own problems of reading in ways which seem to be in keeping with the text.
The last example we're going to show a detail of on screen. So leading up to the grand finale before we go to the book in true Shandian style is a picture of nothing. It's a famous blank page where the reader is told to paint the widow Wadman in your mind as like your mistress as you can, and as unlike your wife as your conscience will let you. Now, those are Sterne's words, not mine. This personalizes the experience of reading the novel in a novel way. But the page isn't actually blank, because you see the material traces of the printing processes, the texture of that paper, the indentation of the type, the transfer of the oil of the low quality printing ink from the facing page, or the reverse, the bleed through of the text on the verso. And so you have to create this image. You're given full freedom of your fantasy, but you have to follow the constraints of the book. You become Uncle Toby, but you're under the power of the narrator, and your vision and life experience has to fit within the physical constraints of that printed page, much like the marbled paper. So it seems simple, but it's actually a hugely complex play on the role of the narrator versus the reader, the printed page versus the imagination. And it's a battle of wills, which sounds like exactly the kind of thing Sterne was intending to provide the reader with.
I often use this as an example to sort of point out to the students some of the problems of digitization. So on 18th century collections online, the microfilm, version of this page is missing because it's sort of considered a blank and therefore of no importance. And it just shows, doesn't it? Actually, you do need to read the novel, Elizabeth.
It's not a novel to be read, it is made to be used. I have actually I have read it, but so much of that reading is a physical process of rotating the book.
Absolutely, and dipping in and out is a method I think that Sterne would be behind.
I don't know if anybody followed these instructions in a very literal way. I don't know if any copies that have painted in mistresses. I don't know, Helen, have you seen any?
Well, David might know some. I don't know. I know Jeff Day has pointed out some annotation on this page, which is pretty cool. That's in his monograph From Fiction to the Novel. But yeah, I think people are a little bit awestruck, aren't they? Perhaps a little bit intimidated. I don't know. I prompt you all to go home and write in your copies, draw on them.
But not in the Bodleian's copies.
Yeah.
And on that note,
yeah, there was the exhibition that the Laurence Sterne Trust curated recently, which encouraged artists to do just that, to respond to the blank page. And yeah, there is a fantastic online exhibition that you can go and explore. Yeah.
I'll try to find the link for that. And
yeah, don't let your wife see it.
But for now, let's have their guided tour through the Bodleian's.
Yeah, edition. So Alex is going to lead us through some of the copies that we have on hand here. Obviously, some are in the exhibition. Seemingly floating in space. If you haven't seen it, please go and see it. It looks gorgeous. And yeah, so we're going to start with volume 1, though it is the second edition, and we'll go through the book sort of in order and have a closer look at some of those features that Elizabeth and I have been pointing out. Yeah, take it away, Alex. Look at that offset ink. It's not that dark, though, is it? Like when you compare it to some of those books from 1612 and the commemorative volumes, like they were really, really dark. And I think often the black page is not quite as dark as you might expect. This is one of the darkest ones that I've seen, actually.
Yeah, the pressure of the printing press is distributed across that entire rectangular surface. So yeah. When it's on a page of type, like we're looking at here on the right, there's actually not that much printing surface. If you were to add up the black parts of all the letters, there's not that much, and so there's more pressure applied to them. But when all the pressure is distributed across such a large space as that black rectangle, it's very, very difficult using presses that were available at this time and the printing ink recipes available at this time to give a good, even coverage. Yeah, so I like how much offset there is. You actually have 4 morning pages, not 2, effectively.
Yeah, so all of the first edition tends to, the first edition has black pages back to back, and a lot of modern editions as well. Some of the very new ones would sort of budget a little bit and only do one side. But certainly for commemorative volumes, historically speaking, like some of those 1612 pamphlets that we were showing images of, like or every single page was printed almost in negative. So that's a huge expanse of ink. But I think also what you've got to wonder is, you know, what were they using to print that? Could it have been the reverse of a block that had already been engraved? Could it, you know, was it a blank one that would later be reappropriated? I think it is interesting, isn't it, to think about the tools that are on hand and how they were used. Yeah, so we have the Dublin edition here, which is the Chamberlain edition, which is sort of, if you like, he's the more official of the Dublin publishers. But look at it, it's a double page spread, which has a different kind of impact, doesn't it? It's appearing earlier in the text as well, because it's a much more closely printed volume. I think Sterne had stipulated to Dodsley, his bookseller, that actually the appearance of his text should be strictly sort of like 21 lines per page. He wanted it to be really leisurely and luxurious almost to read. I mean, that, you know, when paper is at a premium, it's quite, you know, it's quite a demand, to be honest. But yeah, the fanciest texts, if you like, were much more spaciously printed. Yeah, so back to Dodsley. Yeah, it was Rasselas and Sarah Fielding and Jane Collier's The Cry as well, isn't it? Those were the two texts that Sterne referenced. And what's really interesting about both of those texts is that they are Dodsley publications. As was, though, Gray's Elegy, you know, and Gray's Elegy is one of the foremost sort of mourning texts of this period, and it came with sort of mourning iconography too. So here we're looking at the marriage agreement, and this is like a very long extended joke which goes on, which cites at length from the marriage agreement between Elizabeth and Walter Shandy, Tristram's parents. And you can see how blackface type has been used to sort of emphasize how long this thing goes on, and also, you know, the legal terminology and the fact that, you know, the appearance of such a manuscript would have been written in sort of secretary hand. Perhaps there is also a suggestion that this is quite an outdated sort of settlement that's happening here, and that perhaps Elizabeth is not getting the best deal.
I think it's interesting for me that that type is used to emphasize the bureaucratic nature of the form, the and also, and the thereby, not the
repetition.
So, yeah, exactly, and so it made the poor printers go to some effort in order to emphasize text that then decentralizes this kind of novel to make it to emulate.
But there is a contrast, isn't there, between the sort of and therefore and the whereby and the alsos, which come in a sort of like in a very regular manner, to the sort of the antilinearity of Tristram's own narrative, which cannot go in a straight line at all. But yeah, I think it's a really lovely example. Thank you. Okay, shall we have a look at volume 3? Now, I think we've had some talk about this in the chat, which is the marbled page. Oh, there it is.
I can't hear. Was Alex saying something?
She said she's gone back to the Dublin edition.
Ah, okay, thank you.
And so this one, could you move it down attached, so we can make clear that it hasn't been hand stamped. See, they've cut a corner here. You know, there must have been a cost and a time involvement. That, you know, come the 3rd edition or whatever it is out of Dublin, that we're thinking, no, we just can't be doing that. And you can see it's been tipped in, and the pages have been regularly paginated. So we go from 124 to 125 with the marbled page inserted in between, sort of bound in. So Tristram Shandy tended to be sold in sheets, like sewn rather, which meant that the volumes sort of came in the right order, and then you would then take them to your bookbinder to be bound as you wished. But because they were sewn, the marbled page would usually be where you would expect it to be. You wouldn't have to sort of decide, like you might have with a sort of copper plate engraving or illustration, where you want to put it. You know, it would be put where you were given it, really. But I think this one, especially on the verso, you can see how the ink has sort of trickled down a little bit into where the page has been folded. There's a sort of a very light shadow of the where the margins have been folded back, so that the page could be laid in the bath of marbled ink. Aren't the colours gorgeous though?
Could you turn that back the other way, Alex, please? Because I like here that it says in the text that so, I mean, knowledge, you will no more be able to penetrate the moral of the next marbled page, motley emblem of my work, than the world with all its sagacity has been able to unravel the many opinions, transactions, and truths which lie mystically hidden under the dark veil of the black one. And so he's saying that this marbled page is the motley emblem of his work. This represents his work, but his work is of writing, of producing a novel, of a text that can be repeated multiple times. But marbling is such a difficult to repeat handmade process that he is saying the motley emblem of his work is something that is created by somebody else to be diversely interpreted by the reader. I really enjoy the complexity of the interaction of the printed and the non-printed content here.
And also of the narrator, Tristram, addressing the reader there and saying like, haha, you're still getting it wrong. You still don't understand what the black page is. Here's another one, try this one. It's even worse, do you understand? It's like, it's almost like my work is unknowable, isn't it? This is a motley emblem of my work, but you could have a go interpreting that and you could be here forever.
He did enjoy breaking the fourth wall. I mean, it starts with him sort of castigating the reader for interrupting his father, as he is. Well, let's not get into that. It's not particularly safe for work. But he does castigate the reader repeatedly for interrupting or for not fully understanding, or saying, here, this is very clear. Here's the emblem of my work. But of course, you can't interpret that. Do we have more examples to look at, or should we go on to the? Okay, great.
Okay, yeah, so we're looking at the Dublin edition this time.
Fourth volume.
And this is the chasm of 9 pages. And I'm honestly, I'm surprised that this is the Dublin edition, because there are very, very few editions ever. This is, it's maybe the only other one that I'm aware of that actually sort of managed to what's it, I can't even take that away. What is 123 take away 112? Is that 9? 11. Oh, so there you go. They haven't replicated it, because the problem that comes if you take out 9 pages, which hasn't been done since the first edition. If you take out 9 pages from a book, then all of a sudden all of the pages on the right hand side are even numbers. It's so that like absolutely messes with the physical form of the book and with our expectations, but also with the printer and the binder's expectations. That must be nightmarish, right, to deal with. How you figure that out. And so clearly the Dublin edition, the producers of the Dublin edition have gotten around that by sort of making up a chasm, the extent of the chasm. Judith, well done. She's managed to achieve that in the Norton edition. We'll refer everybody there. So
please put a link to that in the chat if that's available, or if there's more information about how that actually looks on the page. That'd be wonderful to see. Thank you.
Yeah, so it causes major problems in the print shop, but is a really an arresting moment in the novel, which takes you out of the text. We talk about the sort of suspension of disbelief or whatever, the Keatsian notion when we're reading a novel, that we're in this shandy world, we're experiencing this sort of very parochial kind of household environment, and then actually the kind of games that Sterne is playing with the medium upon which we're experiencing that world are just tipping us out of it all of the time, to encourage us to consider the fact that we're looking at a piece of technology in our hands.
We have about 5 minutes left. Should we talk about one more example and then go back to the slides to talk about some of the broader context for this and ways to go forward?
Sure. So we've got another more neatly produced image of the strike through Bravo, which is about a third of the page down on page 32 in the Dublin edition, which is very nicely done. And what else did we have to show? Was that everything, Alex? That's it, yeah. So we can take it back.
Can you point to the Bravo?
Yep.
Perfect. And then also, while we're on that page, can you talk just very quickly about that extraordinary word that is 1 line, 2 lines from the bottom?
Yeah, I don't know. Tell me then, why should they not be printed together? Yeah, I can't remember. Yeah, dots have underlined it as if it's a typo.
I don't know. Oh, that's wonderful. That looks like that was added by a reader. I wonder if there's any more annotation. Yes, it is. Meneer is Dutch for Mr.
Cool, thank you.
Wonderful. It's interesting to see that what kind of content is annotated by earlier users. I will not say readers, but users of copies of Tristram Shandy. It absolutely breaks every rule. I think before we end, I'm going to go back and share screens of a couple of slides. Yeah. Are we up now?
Yeah, we've got you.
Hey, wonderful. If you'd like to know more and be able to zoom in with wonderfully high-res images, Sterne and Sterneana is the place to go, and Helen is much better placed to talk about this than I am.
Yeah, so if you want to look at actual copies of the first edition of Tristram Shandy, my friend Mary and I have digitized them as part of the new data set, which is called Laurence Sterne and Sterneana, hosted by Cambridge Digital Library. You can actually, I know like it's not great to see a digital surrogate, if you like, and we sort of, we as a book historian, I'm always about, getting out there and handling the original thing. But in the absence of the original thing, this site actually photographs the books at a resolution, which basically means you can zoom in to see things that the naked eye could not. So this is it's been really surprising to me, the sort of the wonderful sort of intricacies of binding and things which have become visible through photographing this amazing collection. So you can go through and you can have a really close look at the first edition of Tristram Shandy and of Sterne's other works, but you can also explore some of the adaptations and the continuations that the novel prompted from its inception in 1759 through to around 1830. So feel free to go and explore.
I see a comment from Mary Newbold that
hi Mary.
Thank you. There are two, so she references two publications that describe interventions, I guess readers or users' interventions with doodling or drawing a female figure and somebody's written on the blank page. This is why that copy-specific research is so important, that if you've seen one copy or used or read, I won't say read, one copy of Tristram Shandy, it's only the starting point. The copy specificity is incredible, and that includes the annotations.
And then before you know it, you've become a collector.
Yes, if there are tons more out there, I would be very excited to know, because I have, in my own very limited ways, tried very hard to find examples, and that they're not very easy to find. Thank you very much, Mary. I look forward to reading that. And David Brewer has said, there's another way in which the marbled leaf brings the outside in. The marbling involves use of ox gall to change the surface tension of the water, while most of the early copies would have been bound in calf. That is an excellent point. And the oxen were castrated, of course. One of the ongoing themes is the thread over Tristram and Toby. So that is excellent. Thank you so much, David. Wonderful. And to end, this is just the starting point of what you can do if you're on site at the Bodleian, or if you are viewing from home remotely. There's an exhibition, Sensational Books, at the that's available now at the Weston Library. It's free. And sorry, is there an issue with the screen share?
No, it's fine.
No, okay, sorry, there's a strange flicker.
It just should be 2022. I realize that's my typo. Sorry, it's happening right now.
Sorry. But I think here on display, you can see some of the features we've discussed. And the installation design itself, I find a poignant commentary on the evasiveness of this book object. It isn't a book with text laid out to be read. It is a thing that is evasively floating, suspended in space, not weighted down by the physical reality of the heavy object of the book. So please, if you're interested, please do pop around the corner and see this, or do visit the website for this exhibition, or Sterne and Sterneana. This is just a very small overview of just a few of the features that bring together commentaries on the nature of printing, the role of the reader, the role of the author, what a novel is and can be, and what was one of the most baffling and at the same time most significant experiments in print for many, many centuries.
Thank you, and thank you all for bearing with us with this sort of experiment in a hybrid format. And I'll hand back over to Alex. Thank you.
I would say bravo.
I'm going to cross it out.